Okay, for this video, we're going to be talking about something a little bit interesting today. I know I say it somewhat often with it, but this is actually something a little bit different. And I do usually try to get something a little bit interesting for people. But before we get to that, we're going to get to my Patreon thing, because since I'm not up to the advertising level to earn income, I need to be able to earn some type of income. So I will kind of be asking people to donate to my Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/challengehistory. You'll see an introduction here which kind of explains that I am on disability, so I'm only getting just a basic income from disability. It's not much at all. And with that, I am putting some of that money into this podcast, so I don't have much with it. You'll see more about my story with it, and I do need more money to cover certain things such as medical costs and stuff like that. We have levels from a base level at $1, a $10 level, a $25 level, at the $50 and $100 levels. Once we reach those thresholds, we will have at the $50 level a giveaway for a Roman Empire silver coin, and at the $100 level we will have a gold Byzantine Empire coin. When at those levels, once we hit at least a few people on those, and it will be you can see the kind of an introduction thanking people for coming on board at February 23rd, and later on down the road, when I get more people in, I'll put things on for the 25, the 10, and the base levels. And the higher up level you are, the more priority you get for suggesting priority on topics. Within reason, obviously. I'm not going to do any topics in which it would lead the actual tone of the topic, number one. Number two, I'm not going to pick topics that are completely off base of what the channel might become, because I don't want the channel to actually be led by the fans. I don't want the actual content of the channel to lead me either. With it, I want to actually have some control over the channel. So there are those 2 points. So but within reason, I will let them have control over picking those things, and they will have priority over what I was initially going to run for those days, and those there'll be benefits for the people who are higher up, if financially. So the more you donate, the more priority you can get on what you want for the topics. And if you want to increase your influence on the channel, you would be able to, your best option is to donate more. Now, onto this topic, what we're going to be talking about today is the constitutionality of sanctions. And can the government give out sanctions without declaring war first? Now, we're going to look at what a sanction really is. Now, a sanction would be defined as an economic or military coercive measure adopted usually by several nations in concert for forcing a nation violating international law to desist or yield to a junction. Now, if you really look at what we also need to look at is what punishment means is a penalty inflicted on an offender through judicial measure. And we also need to look at what an act of war is. An act of war is an action by one country against another with an intention to provoke war, or an action that occurs during a declared war or armed conflict between military forces of any origin. The loss or damage due to such conflicts are excluded from insurance coverage except for life assurances. Now note that that we cover those three topics with it. Now, if you go to the Constitution, it notes that we go to that this is strictly going out of the power of Congress. Now it says they have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, that's where their power to declare war comes from. Now we also have their another power, which would be something which becomes a little bit interesting, which is to regulate commerce with foreign nations among several states and with Indian tribes. That's another one. And the third one is to where do we see that? To define and punish piracies and felonies committed in the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Now, if we're talking about that offenses against the law of nations, that doesn't necessarily fit under the idea of what a sanction would be. That would actually be, when it's talking about punish, that's actually what would be a punishment. And when we go back to punishment, and that is a penalty inflicted on an offender through a judicial measure. And if we go with that, that's active punishing, which is to impose a penalty for a fault, offense, or violation. This would be in the act of one such event. Synonyms would be on the idea of to penalize or to discipline. Now, if we look into in this, it would be to inflict a penalty on. Now, if we looked on the term of sanction, we would never see you never see basically the term of when we're talking about the term of sanction is in that sense, you never see that being used in when we're talking about the noun. You never see there would be allowance, authorization, clearance, concurrence, consent, granting, green light, leave, license, or permission, sufferance, or warrant. And that would be basically the synonyms on that. Antonyms would be interdiction, prohibition, or proscription on sanction, and that's on the broad sense of it. And it's usually what we call when we look at that, it's more of an idea that's prescribed on the points of military, on the actual economic and military coercion. More on the idea of what we call intervention. And this is not necessarily what we would actually deem as being any part of what is actually prescribed by the founders. Now, if we go to Thomas Jefferson's quote on foreign policy, you would let me get to that point. Let's see if this will load fast. Anyways, okay. Yeah, and the inaugural we had inaugural pledge from Thomas Jefferson, in which he stated peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. So basically, his point with it, and this was essentially our first. This was essentially our when we start to look at the idea of the and he said this in his inaugural address in 1801. And since we view him as the first he was the first Secretary of State in 1789. This should be the actual point in which we view the formation of how we view interactions with the other countries. And we can actually see very, very specifically that the way he meant for us to interact would not have been this, and that would have actually been essentially what we call an act of war. Because if you look at this idea of a sanction with it, it's an economic and military coercive measure. When you're doing that, essentially, an act of war is an act of by one country. It can also be on multiple countries against another with the intention to provoke a war. Now, if you're actually using economic or military coercion to basically go after another nation, whether you feel that they've violated international law or not, that is essentially what you're doing. Is you're committing an act of war, and that's really what we need to view sanctions as. And that's the whole point. That's why if you look at the idea of sanctions, this is really kind of a new idea that is really more of the points of where we get to the idea that it was not really seen until we got this idea that in the liberal foreign policy perspective, which is where we started to call into the ideas of intervention, changing the whole idea of what we were doing. And this really changed what we were actually going into. And when we start to view some of the ideas of the founders, they would never, some of the key founders such as Jefferson and Madison, they didn't believe in these actual methods of dealing with other nations. That's why when you find this, that it was basically that point was actually meant as merely actually a method of when there was actually a formation of some type of a theft between nations, and it was meant to act as some intermediary of companies between nations. And that would be essentially when we were what we were trying to or in certain cases, and also to deal with when nations actually physically attack you, and to deal with it in that case. not necessarily to state that it's meant to essentially provoke a nation to abide by a certain standard of actions that you feel they should, because you don't like what they're doing with their own internal policy, regardless of what you think it is. Because when we start looking at, let's say, for instance, Iran, we don't like that they're developing, that they have the capability, that they might have the capabilities of developing a nuclear weapon. Well, like, let's say, for instance, Israel. Israel already has nuclear weapons. Why do we not essentially follow this idea and sanction Israel? Why do we not sanction Pakistan? Why do we not sanction ourselves? Why do we not sanction the United Kingdom? Why are we not sanctioning China? Why are we not sanctioning South Korea? And so on and so forth. Why are we not sanctioning? Why are we not only not sanctioning Saudi Arabia, but we're actually selling them material to make nuclear weapons with? And these are the actual questions that really show that it's not even a consistency on that, and there's no consistency. And they can go, oh, but they're an enemy nation. Well, that means that it goes down to you're trying to provoke war, which would be an act of war. And if that's the actual case, then that sanction is an act of war, and to do so, you must declare war first. And that's why when we talk about this, if one would actually do so, they must actually declare to actually do so. To commit an act of war, as a sanction should be declared, they should actually technically have to declare war before they commit an act of war. Doesn't matter if you're doing a sanction. Doesn't matter if you're launching missiles at them. The Constitution is very, very specific. It doesn't matter if Congress is doing it or if the executive's doing it. Obviously, the judicial branch can't really commit an act of war in what they're doing, because the way that their powers are structured. But when we because the structure of their power is pretty much, for the most part, within beyond the scope of cases being brought to them, they're kind of limited, but they're actually in this case, they're actually showing that they are actually not able to act on an international scale for the most part. But when we look at the other two, they actually do act on an international. They actually do have the power to act on an international scale. So what needs to be understood is both have actually, when you do put forth sanctions, that is an act of war, and that needs to be understood. And when you do have that, you need to understand that to do that, you need to actually declare war first. And if you're going to, and since nobody is going to be willing to do that, because we have people like Bernie Sanders that basically are just fine putting sanctions on Russia, but they don't want to essentially put their name on declaring war on Russia. And this is where we get to that point. They don't want to put. They don't want to actually put their name on declaring war. And that's the whole point. And this is where we get to. And this is an important argument to make, because when we start to look at what the limitations are, that's the limitation that they need to grasp, is before you do anything, before you commit one act of war, you must declare war. And that's what government has not been doing. And you can't just do anything in a vague sense. And since we know the Constitution is a very, very strict rule book, it needs to be followed very, very strictly. It's not essentially this general guideline that you can follow it whenever you want, and you only have to follow the parts that you want and you can ignore the rest. That's not the way it works. You have to follow it. When you take an oath to it, you have to follow it 100%. You don't get to say, oh, I'm not going to follow this because I don't like that part. And I'm just going to ignore that part because it just doesn't fit to my ideas. Well, if it doesn't fit to your ideas, don't get into government, and frankly, you should probably leave the country because you don't fit to the idea of liberty. Because you probably love tyranny better, and you'd probably fit with one of those other countries that embraces tyranny. And that's where we're at, and that's the whole point of what we find. And this is not a broad sense of how we look at things. We need to understand that when this is meant, if we're meant to penalize another nation, it's meant as a single penalty. It's not meant as an ongoing penalty and to essentially blackmail anybody and extort and try to stop anybody who wants to actually deal with those other nations. That's not how these things work. Those nations are free to work with anybody that they want. And it doesn't matter who's out there. And when you're doing this to try and essentially force other people to abide by these bogus rules, that's essentially an act of war. You're trying to essentially economically cripple a nation, and that's essentially the modern day blockade. And when you do that, that's an act of war. That was essentially what the United States did to Japan by use of China, that actually got us into World War II. And that's how we actually got ourselves into it. It had nothing to do with Japan attacking Pearl Harbor. That was merely an actual reaction to what we were doing before. And that's where we get this idea of how you actually commit an act of war. And that's what an act of war is. When you do these things, when you do a blockade on another country, you're going to infuriate them because it's going to cause massive problems for that other country, and they're going to attack you. And that's what's going to happen, and they're going to hate your country. And that's what intervention does. And that's the end cause of it. And you end up creating your own problems. So and you can't do that without a declaration of war. That's why that would be unconstitutional. And the problem is we have a judicial branch that doesn't pay attention to any of these things. They're saying, "Oh, we'll just let it go by." Well, no, you have to be more aggressive on this. You have to tell them, no, you can't do that without declaring war, and make them actually put their money where their mouth is, and where no one wants to do that, because the fact is, if they did, then what would happen is you would actually kill intervention within about a week, and no one would ever intervene in another country's affairs in the U.S., and it would be over, and the idea of this intervention would be killed so fast that basically our foreign policy would totally change, and all of our people would be coming home, because you would actually have to prove that you would be declaring war naturally. And nobody in Congress would ever want to be putting their name on that, because it would basically be a death sentence. And and that's where I'm basically going to end this, and we're going to say, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, And make sure you share it all around social media. Make sure you check out my Patreon page. That's www.patreon.com/challengehistory. If you can't donate, make sure to share with someone else who can. And that's about it. And I will see you guys either later today or probably tomorrow. Bye, everyone.